For the first time, the American intelligence has confirmed the accuracy of reports published by the Wall Street Journal last month. The report discussed classified information that was leaked for the first time. This information reveals that over the past years, China has established a series of military and intelligence bases in a very dangerous location. This place is on the American borders. After the accuracy of this information was confirmed, a significant political and media earthquake occurred in the American political environment. In addition to this, the American intelligence also confirmed that China is working on another dangerous project called Project 141. The meaning of 141 is still unclear to date. However, information suggests that this project involves deploying a series of military bases in areas of American influence around the world. This video is one of the most important ones that will clarify to you that the war that has started between China and America is not only a trade or economic war, but also a war of geopolitical influence. Added to these wars is the information warfare, which is the most dangerous because the victor in the information war will be able to dominate politically and economically. This explains why America wants to shut down the Chinese TikTok app nowadays. Let me remind you of the news we heard about 4 months ago when a Chinese balloon entered American airspace, and it was a spy balloon. It was going to cause a diplomatic crisis, but America overlooked the matter because it also engages in similar actions of airspace breach. Before explaining the military bases of China on the American borders, let me talk to you about what America is doing around the world to encircle China. The United States of America has more than 800 military bases around the world, but a significant portion of these military bases are in countries allied with America adjacent to the Chinese borders. The clearest example of this is Japan, which is close to China, only a few tens of kilometers away, meaning a very short distance. Japan alone has 120 American military bases hosting approximately 50,000 soldiers, which is a huge number for a base located outside America. Another example is South Korea, which is closer to China than Japan. South Korea has 73 military bases, so we are talking here about a military siege on China. Added to this, news spread last month about the establishment of 4 American military bases in the Philippines, which also has maritime disputes with China. Added to that, America's major ally in this region is Australia, and it's easy to understand why America and Britain agreed on the largest nuclear submarine deal in history for Australia. Thus, China sees itself being militarily encircled from all directions. In addition to this, China also sees that the United States and the West are economically encircling it by preventing modern technologies from reaching Chinese companies. Added to this is that the United States is trying to limit Chinese political influence in the Middle East and other regions around the world. What does China do to respond to this? China is perhaps the only totalitarian country in the world that can be described as a state of institutions. A state that has strategic research centers capable of devising plans to deal with the challenges it faces. Therefore, China began to implement a project called 141, under which China will launch militarily around the world. So, has China actually started this project? I tell you, yes, in a very short period. Approximately from 2017 to 2019, it established its first military base. This military base is located in Africa, which is considered a hotspot for conflict between major countries. China chose the state of Djibouti to establish this base in exchange for economic facilities and projects. Interestingly, this military base is adjacent to an American military base located in Africa, so the distance between them is very small. This is because this region of Africa is the most important of all. It's what is called the Horn of Africa, and its importance lies in its proximity to the Bab el-Mandab Strait, which is currently controlled by the Houthi group. But the important question here is whether China can establish military or intelligence bases near the American borders, as America did against China. To answer this question, let's see how China began to achieve this. It also began to break the military siege imposed on it. For example, China made another deal with a region or country known as the Solomon Islands. This country is geographically located in the area that separates the United States and Australia from China. China went and made an agreement with it to establish a military base, or more precisely, a group of military bases there. This means that China is stepping into the region where America has military bases and is trying to break the line that connects Australia with America, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. 6 countries like that. The third step. After Solomon Islands and Africa, which began in 2014 after Russia took over the Crimean Peninsula of Ukraine, China began to think of taking advantage of this event, which occupied the West and the United States and made them fear a war might erupt at that time. China began to exploit these changes to approach American borders. So, it made a deal with Cuba. By the way, Cuba is about 93 miles away from the state of Florida, USA, roughly 120 kilometers. Let me surprise you and tell you that the distance between Cuba and America is the same as the distance between Taiwan and China. What does this mean? It means that China is dealing very intelligently with the problems it faces, especially from the American government. The action China took when it established military and intelligence bases sends a clear message to the Americans, saying if you come to our borders within 90 miles in Taiwan, we also have the capability to reach your borders at the exact same distance. So, we'll go to Cuba and establish intelligence bases there, which later may transform into military bases. And mind you, this is not about a single military base. The news circulated in the press and the media says that so far, or what has been confirmed, is the establishment of 4 military, training, and intelligence bases, meaning it carries out military training tasks in Cuba or any other Latin American country or for officers in Latin America, most of whom are opposed to American policies. In addition to this, it carries out intelligence tasks. As I mentioned to you at the beginning of the video, if you remember the story of the Chinese balloon that America found moving above its airspace. What caught my attention in this incident is that it's very hard for a balloon to move the direct distance between the United States and China because it's a very large distance. This balloon must have been launched from a nearby military base. Here, let me tell you that China is not the first country to establish a military or intelligence base on the American borders. It was preceded by the Soviet Union, and you might have heard about the Cuban crisis in 1962, when the Russians sent nuclear missiles to Cuba. Imagine a Russian nuclear missile located on the American borders, just a few miles away. Of course, the Americans did not take this lightly, but the Russians used the incident to make America move its nuclear missiles that were in Turkey at that time. So, America had nuclear missiles in Turkey, and the American nuclear missiles were withdrawn from Turkey in exchange for the Russians withdrawing their missiles from Cuba, a quid pro quo. But this doesn't mean that the Soviet Union removed all its military forces and bases from there. There was still an intelligence military base located about 93 miles from the state of Florida, USA. This base remained until after the collapse of the Soviet Union until the year 2002. In that year, Russia, which emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, had financial crisis and couldn't afford to pay $200 million annually to Cuba for the presence of the Russian base there. So, the Russian base was closed. And here you might logically ask, what benefit does Cuba gain from the ongoing battle between China and America? The answer to this question is in 2 points. The first point is that Cuba has a historical enmity with America. We all know that Cuba was a communist country and the United States was at war with the communists. America tried to strike Cuba and assassinate its leaders during that period, Therefore, there is a historical enmity that makes Cuba lean towards China's side. The second point is that China will pay or has paid billions of dollars to Cuba in exchange for the presence of its military bases on Cuban soil. Here, let me talk about a very important point or question. Are the military bases that have been established and will be established by China in Cuba in the future large military bases? Meaning, are they huge bases with tens of thousands of soldiers, missiles, armored vehicles, and tanks? And can these bases defend against an American attack on Cuba or on these bases themselves? The answer is definitely no. The primary purpose of establishing a base like this is two main things. The first point is training for the country where the military base is located and forming military alliances with the countries located in Latin America like Venezuela, Cuba, Brazil, and other countries that oppose American policies. So, the first purpose is training and forming relationships. Don't forget that training military leaders is important for extending influence, as America does by training military generals from dictatorial states. The second purpose of China doing this is for intelligence gathering. With China's technological advancements, China now has very advanced spying tools. First, China will have the ability to monitor phone calls in a large part of America, especially the southern part, which is adjacent to Cuba. It will also have the ability to know the financial transactions happening in these areas. Adding to that, China has the capability to use artificial intelligence to study all these phone calls and extract important information from them. We are talking about millions of phone calls. China will also be able to place electronic jamming devices in its military bases. Of course, these devices can jam military equipment, for example, but not only that, China will also install radars and surveillance devices that can study American military movements. So if America were to launch an attack or a preemptive strike at some point, the Chinese military would not be caught off guard by a strike against it. Of course, China will be able to integrate its military bases being established with the dozens of spy satellites it has launched into space. The next point in China's strategy might be to replicate the experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62. This means China wants American military bases to move away from its borders. This can only be achieved if China has military bases on American borders, and with pressure and negotiation between the two sides, the situation may end as it did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both sides might withdraw nuclear missiles or some of the dangerous modern technologies that threaten the national security of both. Therefore, this might be one of the tools China could use in the upcoming period, especially in the period when it begins to take Taiwan militarily. Now, let's move to the last point in today's video. I told you at the beginning of the video that this information caused a political and media earthquake in the American political scene, meaning there had to be reactions from both representatives and officials in the American administration. So, let me tell you about one of the representatives, one of the most famous ones, Matt Gaetz. This man urged Biden, meaning he asked Biden to use military force to strike these military bases. Of course, this solution might not be on the table because it is a dangerous solution that could cause World War III. In addition to this, the US Senate formed a crisis committee to study this matter, and a group of representatives forming this committee summoned some military leaders to hear their point of view on this matter and what actions could be taken. The study of the matter is ongoing, and we will see what happens in the coming period in response to China.